So if you've read the title, you've probably got a good idea what this tutorial is about. If you don't know what the title is talking about, let me catch you up real quick. So if you want to do some kind of material spread, you're probably thinking of something along the lines of StarCraft 2 with something called creep that spreads over the terrain, making it look weird and organic. However, when I was originally looking for material spread or creep spread in Blender, which apparently was in May of 12th of 2021, I've let this sit for too long. I found fairly lackluster results, or Reddit posts or Blender forum posts that were very technical and that I did not understand how to read at the time. So I ended up making my own video about it after figuring it out myself, and here's the video for it. Also, apologies if this becomes long. I'll try to make the video segmented on things that you may or may not want to know, so it'll probably get more complicated as time goes on. I'm going to also add that this is not a beginner tutorial. A lot of the things that I'm going to talk about may or may not be well known. It's just me talking about my thought process and how I ended up at these conclusions. So I'll probably expect you to know some of the things like what material nodes are. So we're going to start with the basic idea behind this first. So here I've got a simple sphere and I've got an empty. So as you can see, closer to the empty, it's becoming a little bit more white, as the other side is more black. This is just very standard color ramp stuff, and as you can see, as I move it farther away, the color becomes all black, and as I get this closer, it becomes more and more white until it's fully white. No matter where I move this, the color is going to follow it as well. So how does this work? Well, this I ended up finding somewhere on the internet some basic understanding of how to do this. What this is it's a material on the sphere itself. Obviously, we start with the material output principle, BSDF. So obviously we start with the pretty normal things, all that, and a color ramp, obviously. But what we do differently is that we have a gradient texture. What I ended up finding was something called the quadratic sphere. Again, I'm pretty sure this is where whatever I read implied quadratic sphere, but this is what you want to use for this specifically. But if you do quadratic sphere on this by itself, it just kind of does this and goes off, and it won't really, and no matter what you do with this, it won't really care what it does. So what we need to do is we need to tell it, hey, I want this color to be based off of this empty. How we ended up doing this is I plugged in a mapping node, just plugged into this vector over here, an object. This object is, of course, the empty. And then I added down here as well a little value slider, because without a value, it gets a little funky. As you can see, it's almost completely black, except this tiny little spot that's very gray. As this gets closer, it becomes white. However, you'll notice that it's a lot smaller. What you need to do is have a value for scales. You can do this with a simple value, but a box like this, or you can have it in the actual scale sliders over here underneath the mapping node. I just wanted to have it as a normal sphere, so I just plugged in a value. The smaller that the scale value gets, the bigger the effect is going to be. For instance, if I did 1, it gets really small again. If I did 2, it's even smaller. However, if I do 0.25, it's very big now. So you can think of the scale basically as the opposite of what you would expect. The smaller the number gets, the more noticeable the effect will become. And obviously, because this is just a gradient texture, you can just move the two sliders to either side and get a really sharp line in between the two if that's something that you're going for. You can add more colors in between if you just want to make something way off the rails or something like that. Well, welcome to the more advanced things, where things get a little bit more interesting. So as you can see over here, I've got this empty, which is a sphere. I just like the sphere a little bit more in these situations. And as you can see, there's two entirely separate materials. We got this green patterned modeled looking one and this brownish gray modeled one. And as you can see, wherever I move the empty, the material change will follow it as well. So obviously this means that you can have something a little bit more complex than just black and white. It gets a little bit more involved, though. So what we need is a little bit something different. You'll probably see me scroll out and a whole bunch of different things pop up one at a time. We'll get to those as we go on, so just bear with me. So the first thing that we got is what I named green ground, but this is actually for the brown area of the ground, so my bad. And then down here, we've got the also inverted name brown ground, which is actually for the green ground area. As you'll notice in each of these texture coordinates, there's no object underneath them. The empty is not selected here. That's very important for this if you don't want it to go off the rails and do its own thing. So over here, we have what I call the basic one controller mixer. This is just to create this brown and green area. In order to determine what goes where, though, I had to do a mix in order to separate out the two, and then I need some kind of way to tell it to use the empty. So the factor node is what comes into play here. Just focus on this area. This is the important bit for that. This is very similar to what we saw in the first example. This is just a simple color ramp, gradient texture, quadratic sphere, and the empty. The empty is plugged into the vector, mapping is plugged into this vector, blah blah blah, and this goes to the factor. This is because wherever black is going to be, quote-unquote, wherever the black of the factor is going to be, is where it's going to put the green texture. Wherever the white, quote-unquote, of the factor is, it's going to put the brown texture. So if you think back to the original sphere, the black is just replaced with this green, and the white is just replaced with this brown. If you ended up getting something that's inverted, all you have to do is either swap the two colors. So for instance, what I did here, so the black is on the right and the white is on the left here. Or you could just invert where these two nodes come into the mix. I was a bit lazy and just did it the other way. The next thing you might want to do is just have multiple controllers to determine what goes where. So as you can see, I've got this controller controlling this area of the rock texture, and this controller controlling this area of the rock texture, which can blend seamlessly together because it's just one big image that I put over this entire plane. So, how do we do this? This took me about a few more minutes to figure out entirely, but it's actually still not that bad. All you've got to do is tell it to use multiple controllers. For instance, just take one set of the color ramp and gradient texture sets with the first empty, and then do the same thing, but just use the second empty instead. Then you've got to mix them together entirely. No factor or anything. It do exactly 0.5, mix it together, and it'll tell it each to do them equally. It'll put it together, put it into its own color ramp so that it can mix the two areas together, and put that into the factor of the two materials that you wish to use. And when you want to do more than two controllers, you just have to keep adding more mix shaders along the line. So if I wanted to add another one, I would have a mix shader here instead of this other controller, and plug it into the mix shader once again. And you just have to keep doing that along the line for how many you want. I don't know how many it takes to crash a computer, but keep that in mind. The next thing I'd like to demonstrate is that you can, in fact, use this whole setup for images and videos. Obviously, you saw me do that with the rocks and the other things, but over here we've got an example image that shows this little animation that I've made very quickly of a little purple thing going around this really funky blue thing and some... So you can see over here that it's currently over the grass, but as we bring this closer to the center, you can see the coloration of the animation appear, and you can just take this and move it away as far as you want. You can see that if we move it over here, you can just barely make it out. So yes, this works with images and videos as well. All you need to do with this is do the exact same thing. Use an image texture instead of a color ramp. The other thing you can do is tell it where to put like a bump node. So over here you got like this sphere over here and the ground over here around this empty, and you can tell it to move bumps and displacement around as well around these empties. All you have to do instead of using materials is just tell it to plug everything that you want to do into a bump node and attach that instead of to your mix shader. You just have to plug that into a normal. Because if you look over here, this is just all using. It looks like it's connected here, but it's actually connected just to controller 2, which is this empty over here. So it just tells it, hey, go to controller 2, and then over here, it's the noise texture that it tells it to use. Mix it together. It is also perfectly possible to make multiple controllers control multiple textures on top of the same plane. So what it is, I added the 2 textures from before into a mix node, as well as the ground image to another mix node. This mix node of the 2 original ground textures get plugged into this mix node, which includes the rock texture, and if you just want to add more textures after that, make sure you have enough controllers to handle that. Any additional materials you need to add, you just have to keep adding them in a line, just like before when you wanted to have multiple controllers. It should also be possible to add multiple other things, such as particle systems or geometry nodes that are controlled by these controllers as well, but I don't know anything about geometry nodes. I tried to make geometry nodes work, but they don't like me, so I haven't gotten that to work. But it should be perfectly possible to make it controllable using these as well. I've seen a tutorial on that before, so it shouldn't be that bad. Overall, I hope that this helped. Goodbye.